Last time I showed you how I made this workbench. This time I'm going to install a twin style screw vise, pop-up bench dogs, and a vise at that end as well. I had an idea to make some pop-up bench dogs. I bought some cabinet latches online, and what I'm going to do is attach them all to this 2x4 and then screw the 2x4 underneath the workbench so that they stick up into the holes, so that when I push down on the bench dog they'll pop up and stick up about 10 mil. So what I'm doing here is I've laid the 2x4 across the top of the workbench. I've marked where the holes are along the 2x4, and now I'm going to pre-drill the holes for the latches and then screw them in place, and then I'll mount the 2x4 underneath the workbench. At first I started screwing all 4 holes for the latches, but decided that just the 2 on top would be enough. Now pre-drilled the holes in the 2x4 and then screwed it underneath. Now my original plan was to put the dowel in the hole and then use a flush cut saw to cut them flush with the workbench. But the issue I was having was that as I was trying to cut it, the dowel was bouncing up and down on the latch. So what I did is I put the dowel in the hole, marked how long it had to be, and then cut it in my handsaw jig. The next thing I did was I made a J. Bates style twin screw vise. I'll put a link in the description to his build of it. He goes into a lot more detail on how to do it. Well, essentially what I did is I made a quick jig of how far down the workbench I wanted the clamps to go into the workbench. I then put the jig in place and marked where the hole needed to be drilled, took the jig away and drilled all the way through. Now to attach the clamp to the workbench, needed to drill 2 holes into the back end of the clamp. I then put the clamp through the hole, put the back end on, pushed it up tight and screwed it in place. I also repeated this process for the second clamp. I had to mount a piece of 2x4 underneath the workbench first, so I had something to attach the clamp into. I forgot to record this part though. I then began on installing my carpenter's vise. Now, with my carpenter's vise, there is 2 right angle pieces in the back of the vise that I had to cut notches out in the workbench for. So I just marked out where they needed to be cut, sawed them down, and then chiseled them out. I then used a clamp to hold the vise in place and screwed it in from the bottom. I also added some scrap wood to the jaws of the vise. I'm going to change this later, but in the actual moving jaw of the vise, I also put a bench dog in that with a cabinet latch as well. I then set the timber in place that I wanted to use as the back jaws of the twin screw vise, marked the inside of the clamp, and then drilled a hole in this piece so that I could then feed the clamp through and screw it in place. Now I had to attach some scrap pieces of wood to the workbench underneath the rear jaw, and this was just for stability, but once I add the cabinetry, that's going to replace the scrap piece of wood and add that stability that needed to be there. I then screwed the rear jaw of the vise to the workbench, and then repeated the same process to make the front jaws.